All right, we are back on track. But this is very good segue for me to talk about this. So one of the most immediate ways in which the cracks became visible was the women talking about the problems they face with accommodating the devices needed for their work. In contrast to the picture of seamless incorporation into digital worlds, these devices, which they referred to as systems, were big and clunky. They almost sounded like the computers of the bygone past, which is why I put this image on the slide as well. Chandni's employer, Galaxy Pipes, a large domestic company that manufactured plumbing pipes, offered to send a system when the first lockdown was announced. Chandni's role involved data management, and since it was all done online, her work could easily lend itself to working from home. However, Chandni said they wanted to send the system, but in the old house there was only a small room. I did not have enough space to accommodate a big system, so I could not work for some time. Lalita, who lived in a one-bedroom flat with her mother and brother, told me, I have a desk which I needed to have because they sent me a very big system. My system is in a separate room. It is kind of irritating. The room where I sit is near the balcony, so if anyone wants to go to the balcony, they have to go past me and be very careful about not making noise, and I have to tell them to shut up. This made it difficult for her to follow her employer's instructions to keep background noise to a minimum. This is also where the picture of seamless belonging in global corporate digital worlds began to fall apart. Lalita reported, I have to switch off the fan because I haven't faced an issue with Indian customers on call. If I get Indian customers, American Indians, they tend to understand. But Americans, they tend to have a problem with everything, like the sound of the fan or even the light, even the slightest noise. The problem you see is that Americans have very high ceilings, and in India we have low ceilings. So I have to explain that to them and apologize as well in front of my family. I have to switch off the fan at times, even in summer sometimes. Chandni similarly reported that her employer did not want any background noises when she was on call. She said her family ended up having a stricter lockdown because of her. In the beginning, when I was on calls, I would say, don't make any sound, even washing dishes. Then mommy said, everyone knows that you're working from home. Even the big people you have meetings with, they know there will be sounds at home. At home, it's not just a single room. Even when you're calling dealers, you're telling us to go quiet. It's home. There will be noise. There will be food preparation, washing dishes, and all of that. So in contrast to the idea that digitalization offers limitless opportunities, such that women can access the global economy without even ever having to leave their homes, these clunky systems, sounds of fans, noise of the streets and the household served as reminders of the women's locatedness. And again, I think I was really struck in these interviews about all of these references to sounds, right? So I wasn't able to really do these interviews face to face. I was doing these over calls, but they still offered such sensory descriptions of the schedule of working from home that I thought it was actually quite striking. So I think all of this really serves as reminders of the women's locatedness. Now, this locatedness is geopolitical, as is reflected in Lalita's comparison of low ceilings in India to high ceilings in the US, which I think is symbolic for really saying people live with privilege in America and we live in India. So she's really kind of like marking this difference between India and then the customers that she's serving in the US. But I think it also importantly intersects with gender, whereby the sounds of the home recall women into domesticity even as they try to escape it through their participation in the digital world. And I think this becomes more apparent when we start talking about the night shifts that they were doing and some of the conversations that I had with them about that. So the night shifts for which women claim to be night owls led to the resurfacing of gendered safety concerns that the women thought belonged in the past. So Gayatri had experience of working the night shift in the office before the COVID-19 pandemic. She told me in the beginning, the parents were a bit worried because I have always been a pampered child, someone who's always taken care of. Post 9 p.m. I had to be at home and things like that. But later they were okay with it, which to some extent had to do with Selmart, because Selmart had cab services and backup cab services in case there was some problem, and those cabs were always tracked and those tracking things could be shared, so it was safe in that regard. So Gayatri really attributed a change in her parents' attitude. She said initially they were not okay with it, they were very concerned about me, but as this work went on, they actually became okay with it. And again, this is something that I found with research that I've been doing for the last few years. Women often report their kind of first forays into work being more contentious with their families, but over a period of time it kind of settles down and parents become more lenient about how much they can stay out and so on. So this was again a kind of a it reminded me of all the references that I've heard to these kinds of concerns before. Lalita, on the other hand, did not have any experience of working the night shift from the office, and she felt that working from home was the preferable, safe option. She said, I think women are safer in the work from home situation. I haven't been in a cab, but imagine a woman going out in a cab at 3:30 a.m. for 5 or 7 a.m. shifts. It is definitely not safe. So I have a friend whose home is in Rohini and her office is in Noida. By road, the commute is going to take 1 to 1.5 hours, and her pickup has like 4 or 5 stops. So I think I'm safer that way because I don't have to go out and commute. I can just wake up and sit in front of the system. Now, what I think is really interestingly happening here is that there's this kind of resurfacing of the safety concern that the women themselves are reproducing. So Lalita hadn't worked in the office before, but she's kind of talking about, oh, imagine if a woman has to go out and do all of this work, and is making references to her friend. This is something that's not hugely common, but had still become common through women's work in the call center industry, which Reena Patel writes about. And I think Lalita is really reiterating what Reena Patel has written about many years ago with reference to call center workers in the early days of the emergence of the BPO industry in India. So again, this felt like it was a kind of reference to the past, to the conversations that we seem to already have had, but that are now resurfacing. So her narrative on the basis of working from home reconstructs the home as the sphere where women belong and are importantly safe. Sensing their way through this resurfacing of this narrative, women also expressed frustration at the inability to leave the house and engage in outside activities during the lockdowns. Expanding on the feelings of monotony and boredom at home, Ankita, who worked for a multinational IT consultancy, explained, the whole day at home, you will hear people talk about marriage, this guy, that guy, just this. What are you going to do to divert yourself? At most, you will watch a series, you will go out for a while, do yoga, what else? You have to stay here only, then they will again go on with marriage. So for Ankita, while she experienced the slowing down of time during the lockdown, in part, she found it relaxing, she said it was nice, but she also experienced an anxious acceleration of time in terms of pressures towards domesticity. And again, this is something that I have thought about and written about before in how women want to physically leave the space of the home to escape some of these pressures by participating in these in work. So in these instances where women's incorporation into digital corporate futures is disrupted by that which is thought to be in the past, including big clunky computer systems, lack of space, street noises that are characteristic of informal economies, household noises reminding them of impending domesticity, and indeed re-emerging pressures of gendered safety in marriage, we see how the present is haunted by the past as well as by the future. So we see time being out of joint. For these young women, these serve as reminders of their vulnerability. They serve as reminders that their subjectivities are unstable and cannot be taken for granted. As they claim a place in modernity by identifying as technology buffs and night owls, they attempt to discard that which is old. So we see Gayatri telling us that in the digital era, her mother became a housewife at the same time as she became a professional, establishing a generational difference between them, and importantly conveying that she, in contrast to her mother, belongs to a modern digital time and belongs to the future. The large systems with their unwieldy wires and routers, the sound of whirring fans in the heat of North India, the clanking pots and pans in the kitchen sink, the darkness of the night lit up by the computer screens are, I would suggest, ghostly images that do not belong in but are nevertheless haunting the digital corporate world that the women are trying to inhabit. So similar to Rita Segato, who writes about gender and coloniality, my search for new concepts was not merely out of voluntariness, but rather argumentative need. This argumentative need in part arises from the dominance of the business and management scholarship on digital futures of work, including the scholarship on work from home. And I think this is largely mirrored in the sociology of work scholarship as well. So if we look at journals like Work Employment in Society, Gender, Work and Organization, most of the conversations around work from home are very limited to one kind of access to digitalization, so digital devices, digital literacy, and then space and kind of dual careers and work-life balance. So really kind of reproducing a lot of the corporate speak around working from home. I'm not suggesting that there's nothing of value in the scholarship. So I think the scholarship is hugely important for informing work practices in the present, for thinking about them in the future, for formulating policies around them and thinking about them thoroughly. But what I'm suggesting is that the scholarship does little by way of offering alternative imagination. Instead, it takes for granted that digital futures are coming, and also often that these digital futures are largely desirable, save for us being able to fix the inequalities in the present. So in that, I would argue that the scholarship mirrors and is mirrored by public consciousness of digitalization. A feminist hauntology which accounts for the past, present, and future makes it apparent that gender, class, geopolitical inequalities are masked by the dominant narrative of digitalization, even as these occur in the present and are already the future as much as they are considered to be the past. Women's evaluation of the experience of working from home, arguably a futuristic practice, is inflected by the past that they anticipate will recur in the future as they face pressures to get married, give in to domesticity, and keep themselves safe at home. Women's narratives show the multiple levels of time that they inhabit. First, time in the immediate in relation to those they're in close proximity to. At this level, women experience their work time as incongruent or out of sync with household time, as apparent in the negotiations that they had to enter to minimize noise to maintain the visage of a sterile space for their employers, clients, and customers. Second, time in terms of life course, which is raising questions over their marriage status and is, of course, hugely gendered. Again, I've previously written about how gender really shapes youth temporalities. So those of you who are familiar with Craig Jeffrey's work will know that Craig Jeffrey shows how young men who are unable to secure employment are stuck in limbo, they're unable to transition into marriage and therefore properly into adulthood. In contrast to that, I have argued that women actually experience slowness or stillness of time in relation to domesticity and pressures of marriage. And thus they resist and delay possibility of marriage as much as they can, and they've been able to do that to some extent through access to work. So as such, young women's time is less about anticipation and actually more about mitigating the past that is inflecting their present and impending futures. On the third level, they are talking about really time as being modern times, which we see established through their participation in an emerging industry, that of e-commerce, their use of digital devices, and engagement in broader digital cultures. But this is then disturbed by a pull into immediate time and, of course, life post time, making it evident that it is not possible to think about time in a linear way. And it is exactly this that made me reach out for hauntology. So as Avery Gordon writes, haunting raises specters and it alters the experience of being in time, the way we separate the past, the present, and the future. Further, I would argue with McPherson, so going back to, I'm not doing this just because I like reading Derrida, I don't. It's not that great, really. But the reason I'm reaching out for this concept is because I think there is an argumentative need. There is a need to try and think about this in other ways to build alternative imaginations. So I would agree with McPherson that this is a political project. Hauntology, she writes, is a resistant concept because it highlights that any dominant discourse or set of social conditions have become so by systematically repressing alternatives and preceding regimes of truth and ways of life. But does haunting lend itself to social justice by highlighting the persistence of inequalities? More importantly, in being haunted, do women demand justice themselves? So rather than locating justice as a direct outcome of hauntings, I would argue that the hauntings are disruptive, that they are personal and public reminders that digital futures are far from utopian, and that therefore they push us towards alternative imagination. And just as a very final note, I think this raises larger questions around, and I'm not planning to really answer those questions here today, but I think it does raise a larger question about where do we place gender inequalities in terms of time? What is the temporality of gender inequalities? Do we conceptualize gender inequality as a thing of the past, as the digitalization discourse does, as an ahistorical thing, as is often evident in the use of the patriarchy as a concept, or as a present which will not be there in the future if we kind of try to change things now, or as something completely different? So let's end on that kind of larger question of where do we locate gender inequalities in this temporal framework. Thank you.